Good afternoon. I'm Sandy Tuckey, Second Vice President of the Barrie Chamber of Commerce, and I would like to thank you all for joining us with our session today of understanding AED, first aid, CPR in the workplace. I would first like to begin today's session with the land acknowledgement. In keeping with Indigenous protocol and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, it is customary to acknowledge the traditional territories and ancestral lands of the Indigenous people. We would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which we operate. It has been the site for human activity for 15,000 years. The land is in the ancestral land of the Huron-Wendat and the Anishinaabe Nation. The treaty that was signed for this particular parcel of land is collectively referred to as the Williams Treaty. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture. We also recognize the enduring presence of the Indigenous peoples on this land. We are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. Miigwech. You never know when anyone in your workplace may need CPR or first aid, and having trained staff is critical in these emergency situations. Automated external defibrillators, AEDs, help thousands of lives in Canada each and every year. The statistics on survival with AED used within minutes are amazing, giving people a significantly higher chance of survival. Our professionals are going to speak about why you should consider having an AED in your workplace, the regulations you should be aware of for AEDs, first aid, and CPR, and the key points to look for before booking a training session online. I'm going to introduce to you Cheryl Claringbold, Kevin Gee, and Martin Andrews. First, Cheryl Claringbold, HR Performance and Results. As HR partner, Cheryl provides a full complement of services and support to our clients at the senior level, from complex advisory services to conducting workplace harassment investigations to developing and implementing human resources and health and safety programs. Kevin Gee, Barrie First Aid and CPR Training. Kevin opened Barrie First Aid and CPR Training in January 2019 after teaching with EMT Canada. He has a background in construction, transportation management, and paramedic training. Martin Andrews, Vita First Aid. Martin started his company in 2018 and helps to save lives by making AEDs more accessible. Martin was part of the group that successfully lobbied for Ontario Bill 141, mandating AEDs in certain locations. This bill received royal assent in 2020 and is just the beginning of making AEDs required in workplaces similar to the fire extinguishers. Cheryl, we're going to start with you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today along with Kevin and Martin, and on behalf of the Barrie Chamber of Commerce, thank you for having us. So as Sandy mentioned, we're going to talk today a little bit about understanding first aid, AED, and CPR in the workplaces, and our tips and facts on what you need to know. So for my part today, I'll just be talking to you about the first aid regulations and specifically what is required in the workplaces. So just a couple of comments initially. I'm not sure if everyone has seen this booklet or not. It's called the First Aid Regulation 1101. It's a red and white booklet that you should have in all of your workplaces, and it should be posted on your health and safety bulletin board. The booklet is downloadable from the internet. Certainly if you need a copy and don't have it, I'm quite confident through the chamber we can get that out to you. So this is the booklet that outlines all the regulations. It's very easy to navigate through and easy to read. And so I'll just speak to the regulations as it relates specifically to the size of workplace in terms of the first aid certifications that you're required to have. Regulation, in the regulation section 1, it states, I just put it on the slide, a first aid station shall contain a first aid box containing the items required by this regulation and a notice board displaying the board's poster known as Form 82. This is the poster 1234 that you might be familiar with, and the valid first aid certificates of qualification of the trained workers on duty. You are required under this regulation, every workplace in Ontario for every shift must have at least one certified worker during any shift. So their certificates, their valid first aid certificates must be posted on this bulletin board. And then the section 2 there just relates to a first aid station that shall be in charge of a worker who works in the immediate vicinity of the first aid station and who is qualified to give first aid as per the standards required by the regulation. So that's just a really quick summary of the regulations as it relates to the first aid requirements under 1101. So with respect to the specific requirements, there are different requirements depending on the size of your workplace. And as it relates to the first aid certification, it actually is the same. What is different is the first aid kits, the number of items you have in the first aid kits, and as your organization gets larger, whether you need an actual stretcher, a first aid room, etc. For the purposes of today, we're not going to cover that. I wanted to specifically focus on the first aid requirements as it relates to the first aid certification. So when you look at this requirement, Regulation 1101, you'll see different sections. So Section 8 speaks to every employer not employing more than 5 workers up to, not more than 5. Section 9 speaks to not more than 15, so from 5 to 15 workers. Section 10 speaks to 15 workers up to 200. And in each of these sections, it speaks about an employer ensuring that the first aid station is at all times in charge of a worker who is the holder of a valid St. John Ambulance Standard First Aid Certificate or its equivalent and works in the immediate vicinity of the box. Further in the regulations, Section 11, this reflects an employer employing 200 or more workers. Again, a few different requirements here. You do need a first aid room in this case. But as it relates specifically to certification, again, there must be a worker who holds a valid St. John Ambulance certificate or its equivalent, and they must be working in the vicinity of the first aid room. And the certificate in this section states as well, the certificate must be prominently displayed in the first aid room. If you're an organization that has less than the 200 workers, then as per that first regulation I pointed out, your certifications or the certificates of the individuals who are certified in your workplace just must be posted on your bulletin boards. Oh, yeah, sorry, I guess that's it for my part. I assume we'll have questions at the end, Sandy, is that correct?
Yeah, we'll go through the 3 of you and then we'll do our question and answers at the end.
At the end, okay. Okay, so I will turn it over now to Kevin. I believe you're next.
Yeah.
So Kevin's going to talk to you specifically about first aid certificates and their requirements, expiry dates, etc. So take it away, Kevin.
Thank you everyone for coming out today and having me to speak on behalf of this portion with first aid certificates. So some of the things that have come up with at least myself being a first aid provider are that I believe people need to understand that first aid and emergency first aid and standard first aid come from, the certificate has to be coming from a WSIB approved provider. There are currently no online only courses that will cover this. So if you go to the WSIB website, you can see a list of providers that would be equivalent to St. John's Ambulance or Red Cross that are allowed to be trained in Ontario. If your certificate does not come from one of those providers, it's not valid. So companies right now can come from first aid providers that are WSIB approved, or they can be a company that is an authorized affiliate, such as myself, Barry First Aid. Now, when we're looking for online only courses, none of them are approved. We currently are allowed to have blended learning options, which gives us a half online and half in-class course, but you must come into a class to at least show your specific skills. Another thing for companies to consider when we're talking about first aid certificates are, since the pandemic has started, we're allowing any first aid certificates that have expired after March 1st, 2020. Currently, the WSIB is allowing them to be extended until December 31st, 2021. So if your first aid certificate is expired, it may still be valid as long as it expired after March 1st of 2020 when the pandemic began. Now, specific colleges in healthcare, such as dental hygienists, doctors, chiropractors, they will still require certain courses every single year, but that falls outside of the WSIB regulation. And I'd be happy to discuss any other questions that people have with regard to this and how we can make sure you stay compliant. All right. And yeah, I think that's what I had to discuss. So we'll talk with Martin right now, and he'll discuss the laws and regulations that are coming into place with AEDs and how to help with sudden cardiac arrest. All right, take it away, Martin.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is awesome to be here. I'm Martin Andrews from VITA First Aid. We're a Barrie company coming up on our 3-year anniversary here next month, and actually started, just give you a real quick history. Started this company when I wanted to start a business, realized how many lives could be saved if AEDs were more accessible. Looking at the stats, it's astounding, and realizing how many lives can be saved. So I'll go through some of those stats as I proceed here. But first, let me start and talk about what is sudden cardiac arrest. People often, it's kind of a scary term, say, what is sudden cardiac arrest? Basically, what happens in cardiac arrest is your heart actually stops beating, right? Due to a problem with your electrical circuits and your heart rhythm. So it's different than a heart attack. People, that's a common question, is what's the difference between cardiac arrest and what's a heart attack? A heart attack, is the simple way to put it, is it's a plumbing problem. It's more related to a type of blockage. And the person normally still regains some form of consciousness. Sudden cardiac arrest, when it happens and your heart stops, your body shuts down and you're no longer conscious and you're no longer breathing. So what happens in this particular instance is, obviously the first thing you want to do is start CPR, right? And you know, obviously having completed the training is very helpful to know how to perform CPR correctly. So what that does is basically that gives that person that's pushing that blood through to the vital organs in the body, namely the brain. Your brain actually will start to die after 3 minutes due to lack of oxygen without good CPR. So the person in that situation, so CPR is going to give them a chance. The stats actually show that with CPR alone, people have about a 5% chance of survival in cardiac arrest. But with CPR and an AED, people have about a 75% chance of survival. So that you see the statistics are pretty incredible when it comes to the ability to help save a life with someone experiencing sudden cardiac arrest. But what happens is, though, you have a limited window of time. You only have approximately 10 minutes to help essentially bring that person back to life, because, you know, or unfortunately their organs start to die. So what is needed in this situation in cardiac arrest is an automated external defibrillator. So let me just explain what these aren't. They aren't the ones like you've seen on TV. You know, you see the people going, you know, clear, and they would see these paddles. Yes, that is that's a manual defibrillator, right? These are automated external defibrillators, AEDs, as the acronym is, and they've actually been designed for the lay rescuer. You don't have to be a professional. You don't have to have completed training. Obviously, it's helpful. And as Kevin can attest, all the first aid and CPR training courses now include the use of the AED, which is excellent. So as we'll talk about a little bit later, the challenge is then making the AEDs required similar to the first aid trainings. So basically what happens with an AED is you put the pads on and it does the work for you. It actually tells you, it performs, it checks your heart rhythm, and it advises if a shock is needed, right? It's basically what it is. It's resetting your heart to allow it to restart in a proper rhythm and once again start pumping blood to all your vital organs. Okay, so even newer AEDs even include real-time CPR feedback, where it's actually telling you if you're doing CPR correctly, because what some companies realize is sometimes people weren't. So some newer devices even to say, okay, you've got to press harder, press faster. So it's even giving you, it gives you that real-time feedback to help you, to give that person the greatest chance of success. That's what this is doing, because within that 10-minute window they have, your chance of survival goes down 10% for every minute that defibrillation is delayed. So that's where you have this critical window. And most of the time, unfortunately, EMS is unable to arrive in time to assist these individuals. Logistically, it's just not possible for them to normally get there in time. That's why having these devices in buildings is so critical. So next, regarding Ontario, we were very excited. Last summer, Ontario Bill 141 was passed, which is going to require AEDs in all public buildings, some private buildings. It's going to require all AEDs to be registered with 911. And the reason for that is so that, just say, for example, you call 911 and someone's in cardiac arrest, they can advise you, go next door. There's one in that building, right? So even though you might not have one, there might be one that is close enough to you. And you're going to have to be required to have certain training, signage, and maintenance and testing. Because as I've seen being the front lines of this for several years, it's kind of like the Wild West out there right now in terms of, where the AEDs go, who has them, who doesn't, whether they're maintained. So our goal is to try to change all that. And this government regulations is going to help. We don't yet know when these rules are going to be implemented due to COVID. Unfortunately, there has been delays in the actual formal regulation development and implementation. So hopefully later this year, but we're not sure just yet. And finally, actions needed to help save lives. So people often ask, well, what can I do to help save lives? Basically, by having an AED available in your building, you're helping to equip your facility and your people to be able to help save a life. I realized early on in this business that it's not that people don't care. It's just people often think that it won't happen to me, right? How could this happen to me? But the reality is you don't know when and where sudden cardiac arrest can occur. It can occur at any time, in any place, to any person without warning. So being equipped and having an AED allows you to be prepared to help save a life. And also to just the peace of mind of knowing that you have this here and that your staff, for example, if you're a business, they're not going to be left helpless, in facing a situation like this. They're going to be able to use what they've been trained to do in their first aid CPR training classes by having this device available. As was mentioned, our goal is to help make get AEDs everywhere, similar to fire extinguishers, where they would be in every building, and in multi-floor buildings where they would be on every single floor. We know it's an uphill battle and it's a challenge, but we are making progress, and we're very excited that so many businesses and residences and charities and different types of buildings across Canada are choosing on their own, even though they're not required, to put these critical devices in place. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Cheryl and Kevin. That was very informative for all of us. I do see there's quite a few questions coming into the chat here, so we're going to now proceed with the question and answers. Just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, just pop them in the question and answer field down below, and I will try to get to all of them. I'm just going to go ahead and start up at the top here. Okay, first one. Do the first aid regulations apply to businesses of every size? What if I only have one employee? You guys can just jump in unless I direct it to anybody individually.
I can go back. Oops.
Oh, thanks, Cheryl.
Sorry. Yes, so the first aid regulations do apply even if you have only one employee. So if you're an employer not employing more than 5 workers, if I'm understanding the question correctly, then you will definitely want to make sure that you've got at least one person. If that's, if you're the only person in your workplace, then you know, or certainly if you have less than 5, you are still required to make sure there's one person on each shift that does have a certification or first aid certificate.
Of course. Okay, thank you. So kind of similar, do I have to have a health and safety plan if I am a solopreneur? So again, somewhat same question there.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that, Sandy. Do I have to have a health and safety plan?
Health and safety plan if I'm a solopreneur. So I guess if I work for myself, do I have to have a health and safety plan?
A health and safety plan in terms of like a full policy. I mean, there's different regulations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for all businesses in Ontario. And specifically with 5 or less, you're not required to have a health and safety policy or program in place.
Okay, so that helps there. What are the best ways to identify hazards at my workplace?
The best ways to identify hazards in your workplace. Now, again, I'm not sure what size your workplace is or your industry, is to actually do a hazard assessment. And so, again, you can look to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Green Book, to kind of guide you along. But what you should be doing as business owners or managers or supervisors is under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you have an obligation to take every reasonable precaution to protect every worker in your workplace. And the first step in doing that is to do an assessment of hazards in your workplace. So you'd want to certainly go around your workplace, assess any hazards, whether it's, you know, like we're dealing with right now, COVID is essentially an occupational hazard in the workplace, but you're going to want to look for other hazards. Is there tripping hazards? Is there equipment hazards? You know, do you have adequate lighting in your workplace? Is there exit signs? Are they posted? There's a whole area of a checklist, if you will, that you could do depending on your workplace. But yes, you really want to go around and certainly ascertain whether or not their hazards are in your workplace. Then you're required to identify whether those hazards are a low, medium, or high risk. And depending on the risk, and as well as the frequency, meaning you need to ascertain whether they're going to be something that might happen often or less often or highly unlikely. Once you identify all of that, then you are required to put control measures in place to protect the workers from those hazards. So certainly in a manufacturing environment, there's going to be a significant hazard assessment that probably needs to take place versus an office environment where maybe you will only have 3 or 4 people. Your hazard assessment might be minimal. For example, you have proper lighting, you know, there's access to washrooms, you probably wouldn't have any kind of chemical substances lying around other than over-the-counter things. So quite a different assessment in terms of hazards in an office environment, but you'd want to look at things like staircases or anywhere you think that a person could injure themselves. And so typically the assessments are much greater in manufacturing or those types of industries, construction, those industries where the potential for an employee to injure themselves is greater.
Of course, thank you. Kevin, I'm going to direct this one to you. How can CPR be done safely during COVID?
Thank you so much for the question. This has been a question that we get during almost every one of our training courses right now. When we're talking about CPR and how to do it safely, right now we do have an option, and we have had it for a while, to do compression-only CPR, where we do not actually breathe into the patient. We would also be making sure that we are using proper personal protective equipment, making sure that we don't breathe directly into the patient if we're suspecting they have COVID. And it's also understanding that there's no obligation on someone to actually perform CPR. If you don't feel it's safe, you don't have to do this. But if you are going to do it, it would be a potential hazard. Absolutely. And so you would make sure that you are monitoring for signs of COVID like you would if you were in any other situation where you had close contact with someone.
Right, right. Kind of a follow-up to that question. Here's another one. If I am the first aid certified person in my workplace and I can do CPR on somebody, am I protected under the Good Samaritan legislation as the general public, or is there a higher expectation of me because of my training?
So I'm going to assume that we're discussing this in the standpoint of someone who is not a medical professional. So just someone who is the first aid representative for a company.
Yeah, I think that's
covered.
The question.
Yeah, they are covered under the Good Samaritan Act.
Okay.
And like anything with first aid, if it is unsafe to do so, you do not have to perform first aid or CPR. Your safety comes first.
First, of course. Martin, I'm going to address this one to you. If I buy an AED machine, what service to the machine is required?
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. And fortunately, there's not a whole lot of maintenance that are required with these devices. There's only two real components that you have to maintain, which are the pads and the batteries. Depending upon the type of unit, you know, whether they last 2 years or 5 years, there's all different units out on the market. So what the units do themselves, they actually perform self-checks. You can say whether it's set it up, whether it's daily or weekly. And so they will then notify you. They'll start chirping, right? They'll start beeping to alert you. And they'll also, where there's normally a green check mark on the device, you'll normally have a red X instead. So we recommend the organizations inspect their AEDs a minimum of once per month. And it literally just takes 1 second just to make sure it has the right check mark. And then normally you won't have a problem if you change your pads and batteries prior to the expiry dates. So for our customers, we track those and we let them know ahead of time so that they never end up in situations where the devices are not functioning.
Okay. Another one for you, Martin. Who is responsible for purchasing fire extinguishers and AEDs in businesses? Is it the landlord or the tenant?
Well, fire extinguishers I can't speak to. That's a different scenario, right? And there's different rules and laws that pertain to that I'm not privy to. But as far as AEDs go, there is nothing set as of yet. And I get that quite frequently from the landlord will say, you know, the tenant should do it. And the tenant will say the landlord should do it. So there is no formal requirement for either party to purchase these devices yet. Okay. There will be in time, and I believe through the regulations that will hopefully be made clear.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl, I think I'm gonna direct this one to you. What is my best option for finding a health and safety person for my workplace if nobody wants to do it? And they're supposed to be chosen by the team. Can I make them do it? Do I have to pay them more?
Great question. So again, without knowing the size of your business, I'll just speak to it on an Occupational Health and Safety Act standard. So under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, if you have less than 20 employees in your workplace, so it's more than 6, actually, less than 20, you're required to have a health and safety rep at your workplace. Right. You can have that rep voluntarily, or you can choose who that rep is if you're the owner of the business. Typically, the rep would be somebody in a managerial supervisory role. Doesn't have to be, but you need at least one person as a health and safety representative. If you're over 20, then you're required to have a joint health and safety committee. And yes, one from 20 to 50 employees, you are to have one certified manager and one certified worker rep. So the workers are technically, yes, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, need to be chosen by the workers. And then you can choose the management supervisor rep. If you're over 50 employees, then you need 2 and 2. So you need 2 managers and 2 employees. Again, employees are to be elected and chosen by their peers, and you are to choose the management rep. If you don't have any employees that want to be elected or nominated and elected, you know, you can voluntold someone, I suppose, if you will, which many organizations do, voluntel someone, by the way, you're going to be the health and safety rep. You know, I guess I've done it with a few of my clients where, yeah, there hasn't been a whole lot of excitement, if you will, for people wanting to be on the health and safety team. You know, you can look at doing some kind of incentives for that person. You're not meant to pay them anymore. That's not a requirement to up their salary or hourly wage at all. They are to be paid, however, for anything they do related to health and safety. So if they're attending joint health and safety committee meetings, if you do send them on training, you're required to pay for that. You know, if they're going to get involved in any kind of safety talks or anything to do with, you know, developing the safety program, anything like that would just be paid at their regular wage. So you're not obligated to give them an increase by any means. But, you know, I guess if you've got a little bit of resistance to employees wanting to be on the committee, I would maybe ask why. See if you can, you know, have your management team encourage it. You know, perhaps, like I said, you could offer some kind of incentive or, you know, in terms of, I don't know, maybe you could promote it, give a gift card of some kind, or let them have, you know, additional, a bonus, something. You don't have to do anything, you know, monetary in nature per se. But, you know, you really want to promote health and safety in the workplace. And so I think if you've got some employees that, you know, you think might be interested, the other thing you could do is just ask them to try it for a little bit. It doesn't need to be a full-time commitment, or I mean, a full-term commitment. Lots of organizations, you know, want to change their health and safety reps quite often. So you could just have someone do it for 6 months and have them commit for 6 months. And then you can have another employee do it for another 6 months. You know, there's things like that you could do in terms of just getting them involved and maybe not feeling that it's got to be something permanent long-term. So those are just a couple of my thoughts.
You kind of actually grabbed a couple of the questions in there and answered them. So I don't have to answer a few other ones that are in here in the chat. I'm going to direct this one over back to you, Martin. Will it help with my insurance if I have an AED on site?
There is not yet anything related to insurance with AEDs. It's a little different too. With AEDs are more protecting, you know, the people, whereas your insurance that you have is normally related to your property and your building. So unfortunately, even though we've talked to many insurance companies, we've tried different angles, there is nothing in place yet that will protect you on your insurance premiums. The one thing though that having an AED can help with is, for example, with workers' compensation premiums. If someone experiences a cardiac arrest in a workplace, it can result in a workers' compensation claim. And we know what happens when you have workers' compensation claims that occur in the workplace. That can obviously affect your premiums to where, you know, your premiums can go up, and, you know, heaven forbid, if the person passed away, then you're dealing with death benefits, which can be fairly substantial. So having an AED again can help you, possibly help you as far as workers' compensation is concerned.
Excellent. I think we're coming close to the end of the questions. I'm just going to have to go back because I did miss one here. Oh, sorry, where did it go? When I hire a new staff, how soon after do they need to be WHMIS trained? So this one probably can go to you, Cheryl, I would imagine.
I can answer that. Yep. When you hire a new staff, they are to be trained on WHMIS immediately. So you certainly want to make sure that that's part of your employment practice at orientation. So all staff should be trained on health and safety, your health and safety program, your policy, certainly on WHMIS, respect in the workplace. So workplace violence and harassment as well would fall under that. And so, yeah, definitely you'd want to put something in place with respect to WHMIS.
Right away.
And our firm does lots of that training. So if you need any assistance with that, you can certainly reach out to me.
Martin, I have one more here for you. With the new bill coming in, have they talked about grants or funding to help businesses to obtain an AED? Are there any options right now to help with this cost?
They haven't talked about any different funding options, but there does periodically, I mean, there is what's called a PAD program that is offered through the government, to where there is funds that are periodically made available based on certain criteria. So as with most government programs, it's sort of you know, hit and miss in terms of whether it'll be available when you're looking for it. So, but I haven't heard of any new programs that will become available, but I suspect it's possible because obviously, you know, it's gonna result in some additional costs for businesses. And something else, I think too, businesses will be given a decent amount of time in which to comply with the regulation. So it won't be something they have to do immediately.
Okay, good to know. Kevin, I'm going to direct this to you just to answer for the recording and for the viewers. The first aid course is permitted to take place right now with gathering restrictions in place. How has that impacted pricing?
So with regards to pricing, that would be on a company by company basis. I can only speak to myself, the owner of Very First Aid and CPR Training. With COVID going on right now, we have actually, we understand that a lot of businesses are struggling and a lot of people are individually. So personally, we have actually dropped our rates and reduced them to assist other companies. That being said, that is only Very First Aid and CPR Training. What other companies do is up to them. Now, we are required, so we are still considered an essential service, and we can have groups of up to 10 people in a classroom as long as we can provide and maintain social distancing standards.
10 people indoors. That's a party.
It's almost been fun sometimes. We've had some organizations and companies come together who have been working from home for a year and a half.
Yeah, exactly.
Trying to tell employees, you know, you have to stay 2 meters apart because they haven't seen each other in a year and a half. So it is interesting, but we have adapted techniques and figured out ways to ensure we're following public health guidelines. But
all the more reason to get in and get trained.
Exactly. And we've also, most companies now have a blended learning program where we have half of the program online that you do at home, and then you come in and practice skills.
Excellent.
So it saves time, which is nice. You're not in a room with people for as long.
Yeah. Martin, how easy is it to use the AED in a workplace?
The AEDs are very simple to use. I mean, when I conduct AED trainings, the question people always say, "That's it? That's all there is?" Basically, you turn the device on. It tells you what to do. And some of the newer devices too actually have visual display screens too that actually show you in addition to telling you. So basically you turn on, you put the pads on, it shows you where to put them. And then it basically takes over from there. Even with the devices we sell now, we mostly sell what's called automatic defibrillators, where you don't even have to press the button to deliver the shock. The unit will do it for you. It basically, you put the pads on and it says stand back, and it takes over and does everything. And then you just perform the CER when it's instructed, and it also assists you with that as well. So they're very, very simple to use, thankfully.
Okay, I think I have one more here. With remote working happening now, how does that impact first aid requirements? If I have 250 employees, but only 50 on site, what rules do I follow? I'll send that over to you, Kevin, perhaps, or Cheryl.
Yeah, Kevin, you can certainly jump in if you like. The requirement, what I think you've got to keep in mind, it's a great question. I'm actually not even sure that I've had clients ask me that before. If you've got 200 people normally and you've got 50 people on site, then you're certainly going to want to follow the regulation for the 50 people. So between 15 and 200, then you're going to want to have you know, that certified first aid worker on site during every shift. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway for you, is just to keep that in mind. No matter how many employees you have in your workplace, or if you're on different shifts, you must have at least one certified first aider on site at all times during any shift.
Okay.
Kevin, do you have anything to add?
I think that covers it fairly well. And it's also understanding that we're hopefully going to be coming back into offices at some point. We're not going to be working remotely forever. So making sure that your company is compliant and ready to go when we start ramping up would be very important. But that being said, someone has to be on duty at all times. If there's any
Anybody on site
where you have someone. So you have to have one person on duty at all times who can perform and have a first aid and CPR certificate.
Right. Cheryl, I think you answered this with one of your previous answers, but I'm just going to reiterate it. If my staff are required to be first aid trained, can I ask them to pay for it themselves? Or am I responsible for all certification and recertification costs?
Kevin, you maybe want to jump in too. Unless things have changed, you know, if you're asking them to be certified to first aid in your workplace, then you're going to want to pay for that.
So the employer is required to make sure that they are meeting the minimum standards for first aid and CPR training. That being said, if an employee comes in with a previous certificate, that would still work. As long as it's not expired, that would still cover you under your obligation. So
right. Expiry is 3 years, right, Kevin?
Pardon?
Isn't the expiry, the certificates are valid for 3 years, is that correct?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
So recertification would fall on the employer at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Are all companies required to have health and safety meetings? If so, how often should they be done? And again, this question is just a little directed a little bit differently, but you kind of spoke to that earlier, Cheryl.
Yes, again, depends on the size. So this falls under the Occupational Health and Safety Act regulations. When I speak to that, I'm speaking to the industrial establishments. There are different regulations depending on different organizational industries. But yes, if you are less than 20, from 6 to 20, you have to have a health and safety representative, and you are required to meet. Generally, it's to meet at least monthly, is what we certainly recommend. But it tends to fall sort of on a quarterly basis. I have to go back specifically to the Act to check. But for organizations with 20 or more, so where a joint health and safety committee is required to be in place, whether that's the 2 members from 20 to 50, or if you're above 50 employees, you're required to have 4 members, you must meet at least quarterly. So every 3 months, you are required to have a health and safety meeting. You're required to take minutes of those meetings, and the minutes must be posted.
Of course, of course. Okay, I think we have time for one more question here, and this one's kind of, you know, relevant to what's going on now with the times with us all working from home. To what extent do I have to make sure my employees have a safe workspace at home? Can I ask them to send photos of their space so I know they're operating safely? If they're hurt at home while we're working remotely, is that a workplace injury?
I can answer that, and then certainly if Kevin and Martin want to jump in. It's a fantastic question, and yes, you are responsible. So I do think it's a great idea to take pictures. You know, you certainly want to make sure that your employees are not, you know, they should be doing, actually, back to that question about a hazard assessment, they should really be doing a hazard assessment of their own workspace at home. And, you know, if they're working in a space with lots of distractions, i.e. children, pets, you know, maybe versus, in an open space with lots of, there could be hazards, tripping, versus in an office, there's poor lighting, no windows, you know, just take a look at their actual working from home remote environment, and you are required to ensure their safety. And yes, the answer to that question, is it considered a workplace? Yes, it would be considered an extension of the workplace. So if they are injured, it would be, if you're covered under WSIB, it would be a workplace injury for that reason.
Okay.
So fantastic question. And yes, I would encourage all of you to have your remote workers do an assessment of their work environment and make sure that they're safe, for sure.
Very good question. Last one. How long do I have to keep the minutes from the health and safety meetings?
That's a great question as well. You are required to keep the minutes in a binder. I'd have to go back again and double check. Generally, we keep them certainly for a year. So every quarter, you'll take your minutes and then you file those in a binder. You post the new minutes the next quarter, you take those down, put them in a binder, you post the next minutes the 4 times, and you keep them in that binder for a year. If the Ministry of Labor were to come in and do an audit on your workplace, they will go back and look at those minutes. So you certainly want to keep good records of all of those minutes, any hazard assessments that you do, any near misses or workplace injuries that have occurred. If you've got reports that fall under that, some organizations have hazard reporting or hazard report forms. Depending on your program, you certainly want to keep all of that in a hard copy binder, or even electronically on your network somewhere. But yes, keep them at least for a year, for sure.
Okay, good stuff. That was great, you guys. I learned a lot while joining in this meeting today. So I'd just like to ask each of you to give any closing thoughts on how we spoke today. I'll ask Martin to jump in first with your closing remarks.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, thank you for those people who have attended. I mean, obviously that shows your commitment to safety and the fact that you're willing to learn. And, you know, as we're all looking to continue to learn and improve. And so I just want to say that, you know, obviously meeting all the government requirements is very important. But as we've learned with AEDs, there is additional requirements that the government hasn't got to yet. So, you know, maybe don't use only the government requirements as your benchmark. Maybe look to go a little bit above and beyond that to see, you know, what can we do to ensure that we fully protect our employees. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Martin. Kevin?
Yeah, I wanted to thank everyone for coming out and allowing me to speak on the first aid training side of things. What I wanted to mention is that a lot of times we consider first aid and CPR training to be something that you require just for work. And that is the only place you legally will require it. But that doesn't mean that first aid and CPR issues don't happen outside of work. When we talk about even cardiac arrest, sudden cardiac arrest, there's a significant amount of time that happens in the home. So we need to think of our first aid training and CPR training and AEDs beyond just the workplace. A lot of people come here for a certificate, but what they should be coming for is the fact that they're learning skills that are going to save someone's life. And that can be a coworker next to them, that can be their employee, that can be their employer, anyone that they're around. These skills are going to help people. They are not just a checkbox to make sure that they're meeting their WSIB requirements. These are skills that are going to seriously help people inside and outside of work. And we're covering the workplace side of things, but it's very important to remember these skills are stretch far beyond our WSIB requirements. Thank you for having me out. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Kevin. And we'll close with you, Cheryl.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Yeah, I guess just a closing comment I would say is, again, thank you to the Chamber and to Kevin and Martin for joining me as well, and everybody participating today. You know, as an employer, specifically here in Ontario, you do have an obligation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to take every reasonable precaution to protect the health and safety of your workers. So having qualified first aiders, yes, as Kevin mentioned, obviously a requirement, but it's just a good thing to do. you know, from those, that perspective he mentioned. AEDs in place. I do have lots of clients, Martin, you'll be happy to know, that already have these in their workplaces, and did actually quite a couple of years ago even. And so, you know, just keep that in mind, have your health and safety at the forefront, make it really important in your organizations. I'm sure most of you do already, or you wouldn't be on this webinar. But I think, you know, if we can communicate the importance of health and safety in our workplaces and promote it, have your policies, have your signs up there. You know, if you've got those people that are a bit resistant, try to encourage them, you know, come forward with safety talks, or, you know, just try to always have it at the forefront there, and ensure that, you know, it is of paramount importance for you within your organizations. And not only, as Kevin said, you have to meet your obligations, but it's just, you know, from an employee relations perspective, it'll certainly help enhance those workplaces as well.
Of course, of course. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you all for sharing your expertise this afternoon. It was extremely informative. In closing, I just want to thank all of you again for the work you're doing with your businesses every day. Thank you for the work you've already done to flatten the curve, and for your continued focus on protecting our community. Please continue to shop local, supporting our neighbors and families and friends with your intentional purchasing choices, especially as we move towards reopening. Very exciting times coming ahead. Erie Chamber is here to help you through all of this, so please feel free to email us or call us if you need anything more. Just going to mention a couple of upcoming activities. We've got Embracing Diversity, June 10th at 1 p.m. Our annual general meeting is coming up June 16th at noon. How to Diversity and Inclusion Right, June 22nd at 1 p.m. Facebook and Instagram Demystified, How to Maximize and Optimize Your Business Presence, June 29th at 1 p.m. with Crystal Riviere. And of course, our Chamber Chat Networking at noon on June 30th. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you guys for sharing your afternoon with us.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you, Sandy.